I heard my children laughing in the kitchen about something that hadn't happened yet, and in that moment, I realized they thought my life was already over. It was a strange kind of laughter, not loud or joyful, but controlled, almost careful, as if they were celebrating something they didn't want me to fully understand. I stood at the end of the hallway, my hand resting lightly against the wall, listening without meaning to listen, catching fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense on their own, but formed something unsettling when placed together. "It'll all be settled soon," Vanessa said, her voice smooth and certain, followed by the soft clink of a wine glass. Michael responded with a low chuckle, the kind he used when he thought everything was under control. I didn't step into the room. I didn't announce myself. I simply stood there for a moment longer than I should have, letting the weight of those words settle somewhere deep inside me before quietly turning away. At 72, you learn the value of silence. You learn that not every truth needs to be confronted the moment you discover it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is listen, observe, and wait. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and until that evening, I believed I understood my place in my own family. I believed that despite the distance that had grown over the years, despite the subtle changes in tone and behavior, there was still something solid beneath it all, something unbreakable. I had spent decades building that belief. I raised Michael in a small two-bedroom house just outside Columbus, working double shifts when I had to, stretching every dollar, making sure he never felt the absence of what we couldn't afford. When he married Vanessa, I welcomed her into my home with open arms, the way my mother had taught me. I gave them space, support, and trust. Especially trust. Maybe too much of it. In the months leading up to that night, there had been small things. Little changes I couldn't quite name at first. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Decisions that were made without asking for my opinion, even when they directly involved me. Documents that Vanessa would quickly fold and slide into her bag when I walked by. I told myself it was normal, that young couples needed privacy, that I was simply adjusting to a new phase of life. But standing there in that hallway, hearing the quiet confidence in her voice, I felt something shift. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. I went back to my room and sat down on the edge of the bed, the same bed I had shared with my late husband for over 40 years. The house was quiet again, the laughter replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television in the living room. I looked around at the familiar walls, the framed photographs, the small details that held the story of my life. Everything was still there. Nothing had changed. And yet, something had. They were celebrating something. That much was certain. But not with me. Not for me. Whatever it was, they believed it had already been decided, already secured, already beyond question. I folded my hands in my lap and let out a slow, steady breath. If there's one thing life teaches you after 70, it's that people reveal themselves in the quiet moments, not the loud ones. Not in arguments or confrontations, but in the things they assume you won't notice. In the things they think you no longer have the strength to question. They thought I was done, that I had reached the final chapter, that all the important decisions had already been made, that whatever remained of my life was simply a formality, something to be managed, something to be transitioned. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into the kitchen and demand answers. I didn't even feel the need to defend myself against a plan I didn't fully understand yet. Instead, I did what I had always done when something didn't feel right. I paid attention, because whatever they were celebrating, whatever they believed was already theirs, they had made one mistake. They assumed I wouldn't notice. And they were wrong. I woke up the next morning at 6:30, the way I always did, before the rest of the house had a chance to stir, before the quiet could be interrupted by voices that now carried meanings I had not noticed before. The kitchen was still dark when I stepped in, the early spring light just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting thin lines across the countertop. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might disturb something fragile, though I could not yet name what that something was. I brewed my coffee the same way I had for years, measuring out the grounds, filling the water reservoir, pressing the button, and waiting for the familiar sound to fill the silence. There is comfort in routine, especially when everything else begins to feel uncertain. I wrapped my hands around the mug and stood by the window, looking out at the backyard, at the fence Michael had promised to repair months ago, but never did, at the patch of grass that had grown uneven over the winter. Small things. things I used to ignore. Now they felt like pieces of a larger picture I had not fully assembled yet. Vanessa came into the kitchen around 7:15, already dressed, her hair neatly styled, her expression composed in that careful way she had perfected over the years. She smiled when she saw me, the same polite smile she always used, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said, her voice light, almost rehearsed. I returned the greeting, just as calmly, just as evenly, as if the night before had not happened, as if I had not heard anything at all. That was the important part. Nothing in my tone, nothing in my posture, nothing in my eyes could suggest that anything had changed. She poured herself a cup of coffee, but did not sit down. Instead, she leaned slightly against the counter, scrolling through something on her phone, her thumb moving in quick, precise motions. I noticed the way she angled the screen away from me, subtle but intentional. "Michael has an appointment later," she said casually, not looking up. "We might be out for a few hours." I nodded, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "That sounds fine," I replied. I did not ask what kind of appointment. I did not ask where they were going. I let the information pass through me without resistance, even though a part of me was already cataloging it, placing it alongside everything else that had begun to feel out of place. Michael joined us a few minutes later, his tie slightly crooked, his expression distracted. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek, barely glancing in my direction before grabbing his keys from the counter. "Morning, Mom," he said quickly, as if checking off. "An obligation," I answered just as simply, watching the way he avoided eye contact, the way his movements felt rushed, almost rehearsed. They left together at 7:40, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after they were gone, listening to the silence settle back into place. Then I set my mug down and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I had used for years to keep track of bills, receipts, and important documents. I sat down, opened the drawer, and pulled out the folder where I kept everything related to the house, the accounts, the policies. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything. I had expected hesitation, maybe even fear, but there was none. Only focus. I flipped through the papers slowly, methodically, scanning dates, names, signatures. Nothing looked immediately wrong, and yet something did not feel right either. It was not in the documents themselves, but in the absence of certain ones, in the subtle gaps where information should have been. I closed the folder and sat back in the chair, letting my eyes move across the room, over the photographs again, over the life I had built piece by piece. If they believed something had already been settled, then there had to be a moment when that decision was made. A moment when my role had been reduced without my knowledge. I thought about the conversations I had been excluded from, the times Vanessa had insisted on handling things herself, the way Michael had deferred to her more and more with each passing year. It had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, careful, almost invisible. I stood up and walked back to the window, the sunlight now stronger, filling the room with a brightness that felt almost out of place. They thought I was no longer paying attention, that I was simply moving through my days without noticing the shifts around me. But the truth was, I had just started to see clearly. And once you see something for what it is, you cannot unsee it. Whatever they were planning, whatever they believed had already been decided, I was going to find it. Not by asking, not by confronting, but by watching, by listening, by letting them continue exactly as they were, until the truth revealed itself completely. They invited me to dinner that Sunday, and if I had not been paying attention, I might have believed it was just another attempt at normalcy. Vanessa set the table with more care than usual, placing the silverware precisely, adjusting the napkins until they sat just right, as if presentation mattered more than comfort. Michael opened a bottle of wine he had been saving, something he rarely did on an ordinary evening. It was the kind of effort people make when they want to create a certain atmosphere, when they are preparing for something that requires just enough distraction to keep the truth from surfacing too quickly. I took my seat without comment, smoothing my hands over the edge of the table, noticing the small details that would have once gone unnoticed. The way Vanessa kept glancing at Michael before speaking. The way Michael nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming silent agreements. They were careful, but not careful enough. Conversation stayed light at first, drifting through familiar topics, the weather, a neighbor who had recently moved away, a television show Vanessa claimed everyone was watching. I responded when necessary, kept my voice even, my expression calm. I had learned that people reveal more when they believe you are not looking for anything. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa set down her fork and leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced. "We have been thinking," she began, her tone measured, "about making some adjustments around the house. Just small things to make everything easier moving forward." The words were simple, but the phrasing was not. Adjustments. Easier moving forward. I nodded once, as if the idea had no weight at all. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, giving nothing away. Michael cleared his throat, reaching for his glass before answering. "Just practical things, Mom. Organization. Planning ahead. Making sure everything is in order." He paused slightly before the last words, as if choosing them carefully, as if there were other words he had decided not to use. I watched him take a sip, his eyes avoiding mine again, and I understood that whatever they were discussing had already been decided long before this conversation. This was not a discussion. It was a presentation. Vanessa smiled then, a soft, reassuring expression that might have comforted someone who was not paying attention. "It is just about making sure there are no complications later," she added. "You know how things can get." I didn't know how things could get. I had seen enough in my lifetime to understand what people meant when they spoke in vague assurances instead of direct statements. It was not about clarity. It was about control. I set my fork down carefully, folding my hands together in my lap. "I have managed things just fine so far," I said, not as a challenge, but as a simple fact. Vanessa's smile did not falter, but something behind her eyes tightened, just slightly. "Of course you have," she replied quickly. "This is not about that. It is just about making things smoother for everyone." Everyone. Not you. Not me. Everyone. The distinction was subtle, but it was there. Michael shifted in his seat, glancing at Vanessa again before speaking. "We were thinking it might be a good idea to review some of the paperwork, just to make sure everything is up to date. Transfers, ownership details, that kind of thing." There it was. Not said directly, but close enough. I felt the pieces begin to align, not all at once, but steadily, like a picture coming into focus after being blurred for too long. Transfers. Ownership. Words that suggested movement, change, a shift from one set of hands to another. I did not respond immediately. Silence, when used correctly, has a way of making people fill it with more than they intended to say. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "It would just give everyone peace of mind," she said. "Knowing everything is already taken care of." Already. The words settled between us like something heavy and undeniable. Already taken care of. Already decided. Already finished. I nodded slowly, as if considering something simple, something harmless. "That sounds very organized," I said. "When were you planning to do this?" Michael answered this time, a little too quickly. "Soon. We have already started looking into it." Already started. I let that sit for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them aware of it, but not long enough to raise suspicion. Then I reached for my glass and took a small sip of water, setting it back down with the same steady hand. "Well," I said calmly, "it is always good to stay organized." Vanessa's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she had been holding tension she did not realize was visible. Michael gave a small nod, the conversation shifting almost immediately back to safer ground, as if nothing significant had just been said. But it had. More than enough. By the time dinner ended, I did not have all the answers, but I had something more important. Direction. They were not guessing. They were not hoping. They were acting on something they believed was already secured. Something they believed could not be undone. As I stood at the sink later that night, rinsing the last of the dishes, I watched their reflections move behind me in the darkened window. Quiet. Confident. Certain. They thought the future had already been written. They thought all that remained was waiting for it to arrive. But I had lived long enough to know one thing for certain. Nothing is settled until it is truly finished. And this was not finished. That night, I did not go to bed right away. I turned off the lights in the living room one by one, moving through the house slowly, as if I were seeing it for the first time instead of the place I had lived in for over 3 decades. There is something about quiet rooms that makes memories louder. Every corner held something I had once believed was shared, something I had built not just for myself, but for a future that included my son, his family, and whatever came after me. I paused by the bookshelf near the hallway, my fingers brushing lightly against the spines of old photo albums, the kind no one seems to open anymore. Inside them were birthdays, graduations, small moments that felt important at the time. Back when Michael would look at me with something softer than obligation. Back when I did not have to wonder what was being decided behind closed doors. I carried one of the albums to the dining table and sat down, opening it slowly. The pages turned easily, each photograph carefully placed, labeled in my handwriting. There was Michael at 8 years old, holding a model airplane we had spent an entire weekend building together. There he was again at 16, standing awkwardly in a suit that did not quite fit, smiling in a way that was still unguarded. I studied those images longer than I needed to, not because I did not remember them, but because I wanted to understand where the shift had begun. When had trust turned into distance? When had conversations turned into decisions made without me? When had I become someone who needed to be managed instead of included? The answer did not come in one moment. It came in fragments. Small things I had dismissed at the time because they did not seem important on their own. The year Vanessa insisted on handling all the holiday planning, saying it would be easier that way. The time Michael changed the account access for security reasons and never quite explained what that meant. The afternoon I overheard them discussing long-term arrangements and assumed they were talking about their own future, not mine. Each memory had seemed harmless then, practical, sensible, but now, placed together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I closed the album gently and rested my hands on the table, letting the realization settle without resistance. This had not started last week. It had not started last month. It had been building quietly, step by step, decision by decision, each one small enough to avoid confrontation, but significant enough to move things in a direction I had not chosen. Vanessa had not forced anything. She had guided it. Carefully, patiently, always with the appearance of helping, of organizing, of making things easier. And Michael had followed, not because he wanted to hurt me, but because it was simpler to agree than to question. Simpler to let someone else take control than to examine what that control meant. I stood up and carried the album back to the shelf, placing it exactly where it had been before. Nothing out of place. Nothing disturbed. That was important. They needed to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still moving through my days the same way I always had. Unaware, trusting, predictable. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, leaning lightly against the counter as I thought through everything I had seen, everything I had heard. They were not acting randomly. They were following a plan that depended on my silence, on my compliance, on the assumption that I would not question what was being done in my name. I took a slow sip and set the glass down, my mind moving through possibilities, not emotionally, but practically. If they believed something had already been transferred, already arranged, then there had to be documentation. Paperwork, signatures, approvals, things that could be traced, verified, or challenged. But I could not move too quickly. Acting without knowing the full extent of what they had done would only alert them, and once people feel exposed, they become more careful, more guarded. No, this required patience. The same kind of patience Vanessa had used. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the darkness, listening again to the quiet of the house. It felt different now, not empty, but layered, like there were conversations still echoing beneath the surface, things said and unsaid, plans moving forward whether I acknowledged them or not. They thought they had already reached the end of something, that whatever remained was simply waiting for me to catch up to a conclusion they had already accepted. But they had misunderstood one important detail. I was not catching up. I was just beginning to pay attention. And once you begin to see the full pattern, once every small detail starts to align, you realize something very simple. This was never their decision to make. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because for the first time, I understood that not everything needed to be shared. I put on my coat, picked up my handbag, and stepped outside just after 9, when the neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm of quiet routines and passing cars. The air was cool, carrying that early spring chill that lingers even after the sun begins to rise higher in the sky. I walked slowly to my car, noticing how steady my steps felt, how clear my thoughts had become. There was no panic, no confusion, only a quiet sense of direction. I drove 10 minutes into town, to a small brick building I had passed countless times, but never had a reason to enter. A law office. The name on the door was familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. Harold Benton. He had handled the paperwork when my husband and I first bought the house over 30 years ago. I did not know if he was still practicing, or if he would even remember me, but that did not matter. What mattered was that I was no longer willing to rely on assumptions. The receptionist greeted me politely, her voice warm but professional, and asked if I had an appointment. I told her I did not, but that I would appreciate a few minutes if someone was available. There is a certain tone you develop over time, a way of speaking that signals you are not there casually. She must have recognized it, because after a brief pause, she asked me to take a seat. 10 minutes later, I was shown into a small office where a man in his late 50s stood up to greet me. It was not Harold Benton, but his son, Daniel Benton, as I soon learned. He introduced himself, offered me a chair, and asked how he could help. I sat down, placing my handbag neatly on my lap, and looked at him steadily. I need to review everything connected to my property, my accounts, and any recent changes that may have been made, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush my words. I spoke the way I always had when something mattered. He nodded, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to focused attention. Have there been changes you are concerned about? He asked. I considered the question for a moment before answering. There have been conversations, I said, and I would prefer facts. That was enough. He did not press further. Instead, he asked for my identification, for basic details, for anything that would allow him to access the records he needed. I provided everything without hesitation. Names, dates, addresses, information I had kept organized for decades, even when no one else seemed to think it was necessary. As he worked, typing quietly at his computer, I sat back and let the silence settle. It was different from the silence at home. This one felt neutral, clear, not filled with hidden meaning or unspoken plans. Just a space where truth could exist without being shaped by someone else's intentions. After a few minutes, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the screen with more focus than before. That was the first sign. Not something dramatic. Not a sudden reaction. Just a subtle change in attention. I noticed it immediately. There have been some updates, he said carefully. Recent ones. I felt my hands remain still in my lap, my expression unchanged. What kind of updates? I asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration. Authorization changes, he said. Access permissions. It appears that someone has been added to certain accounts with extended control. The words were measured, professional, but their meaning was clear. Control. Not assistance. Not support. Control. I nodded once, as if this confirmed something I had already begun to understand. And when were these changes made? I asked. He glanced back at the screen. Over the past several months, he replied. Gradually. Of course they were. Not all at once. Not in a way that would draw attention. Step by step. Quietly. I let out a slow breath. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because the final piece had settled into place. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an overreaction. It was exactly what it had felt like. A process. A transition. One that had been happening while I was still living in the center of it. Can these changes be reversed? I asked. Daniel Benton looked at me directly this time, his expression calm but firm. Yes, he said, but it would require your authorization, and it would need to be done carefully. Carefully. I gave a small nod, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made before the question is fully answered. Then that is what we will do, I said. I stood up a few minutes later with a folder in my hand, not thick, not dramatic, but filled with something far more important than paper. Clarity. As I stepped back out into the cool air, the sunlight felt sharper, more defined, as if the world itself had come into focus. They had not just been planning. They had already begun, already adjusting things, already moving pieces into place. And then, at some point, they had decided it was safe to celebrate. I walked back to my car, unlocked the door, and paused for just a second before getting in. They thought it was already theirs, that everything had been handled, that all that remained was time. But they had forgotten something simple. None of it meant anything without me. I did not rush back home after leaving the lawyer's office. Instead, I drove slowly through the town, past places that had once felt familiar in a way that no longer held the same meaning. The grocery store where I used to shop every Saturday morning. The small diner where Michael and I would sit in the corner booth after his Little League games. The park where I used to walk in the evenings when the house felt too quiet. Everything was still there, unchanged on the surface, yet it all felt slightly distant now, as if I had stepped just outside the life I used to move through without question. I parked the car near the edge of the park and sat for a moment with the engine off, the silence settling around me in a way that felt almost intentional. I opened the folder Daniel Benton had given me and looked at the documents again, not because I did not understand them, but because I wanted to see them without distraction, without the presence of anyone else shaping how I felt about them. Names, dates, authorization entries. My name's still there, but no longer alone. Vanessa's name appearing where it had never been before, gradually gaining more access, more control, more authority over things that had once required only my signature. It was done carefully. That much was clear. Not one large change that would stand out, but several smaller ones, each easy to justify on its own. Assistance, convenience, preparation. Words that sound harmless until you place them side by side and realize they all point in the same direction. I closed the folder and rested it on the passenger seat, my gaze shifting to the windshield where the afternoon light had softened into something warmer, more reflective. They had not been reckless. They had not forced anything. They had simply moved forward under the assumption that I would not question it, that I would trust them the way I always had, that I would remain in place while they quietly rearranged everything around me. I stepped out of the car and walked a short distance along the path, my steps steady, my breathing even. There were a few people scattered around, a young mother pushing a stroller, an older man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper, a couple walking their dog. Ordinary life, continuing without interruption. I found an empty bench and sat down, placing my hands in my lap the same way I had in the lawyer's office. There is a difference between reacting and deciding. I had spent the last day observing, gathering, understanding. Now I needed to decide. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but with the same clarity they had used when they believed I was no longer paying attention. I thought about Michael, about the boy in the photographs, about the man who now avoided my eyes at the dinner table. I thought about Vanessa, about the way she spoke with quiet confidence, the way she framed every decision as something beneficial, something necessary. Neither of them believed they were doing something wrong. That was the most important part. They believed they were managing a situation, preparing for a future they assumed was already set. And in that belief, they had allowed themselves to move forward without me. I let out a slow breath and looked down at my hands, noticing the fine lines, the small changes that come with time. Age does not make you invisible. It simply makes other people believe you are. And that belief can be a powerful advantage if you choose to use it. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Daniel Benton's number. I did not call him immediately. I simply looked at it, confirming that I had the option, that I was no longer standing still while decisions were made around me. Then I locked the phone and placed it back in my bag. Not yet. Timing matters. Returning home later that afternoon, I stepped inside quietly, setting my keys down in the same place I always did, moving through the house with the same familiar rhythm. Nothing had changed. Not on the surface. Vanessa was in the kitchen again, preparing something for dinner, her movements efficient, controlled. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, that same composed expression, as if the world was exactly as she expected it to be. "You were out," she said lightly. "I did not know you had plans." I met her gaze for just a moment before answering. "I felt like getting some fresh air," I said. It was not a lie, just not the full truth. She nodded, accepting the answer without question, and returned to what she was doing. That was the second mistake. They had built their plan on the assumption that I would remain predictable, that I would explain myself, justify my movements, stay within the boundaries they had quietly set for me. I moved past her and into the living room, setting my bag down and sitting in my usual chair, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. From the outside, nothing was different. I was still the same woman they had always seen. Quiet, cooperative, unaware. But inside, everything had shifted. They had already started. They had already taken steps they believed could not be undone. And now, I had something they did not expect. Not anger, not confrontation, but control. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that waits until the moment is right. And when that moment comes, it does not ask for permission. I did not change anything the next day, and that was exactly the point. I woke up at the same time, made my coffee the same way, and sat by the same window, watching the same backyard that now felt like a place I was observing rather than living inside. Vanessa moved through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, her movements smooth and purposeful, as if everything around her was already under control. Michael left for work with the same hurried energy, his words brief, his attention elsewhere. If someone had walked into that house, they would have seen nothing unusual. That was the strength of their plan. It did not rely on visible conflict. It relied on quiet shifts that blended into routine until they became invisible. I let them continue exactly as they had been, because people reveal more when they believe they are no longer being watched. That afternoon, Vanessa received a phone call while standing near the kitchen counter, her voice low but not low enough. I was in the living room, a few feet away, turning the pages of a magazine I was not reading. "Yes, we have already discussed that," she said, her tone calm, assured. "It is just a matter of timing now." There was a pause, and I could hear the faint murmur of another voice on the other end, though not the words themselves. Vanessa glanced briefly in my direction, then turned slightly away, as if that small movement would create privacy where there was none. "No, she does not suspect anything," she added quietly. The sentence was simple, almost casual, but it settled in the room with a weight that could not be ignored. I did not react. I did not look up. I turned another page slowly, giving her no indication that I had heard anything at all. That was the moment I stopped wondering and started knowing. They were not just preparing. They were certain enough to speak about it openly, as long as they believed I was not paying attention. Certain enough to assume that whatever role I played in their plan had already been reduced to something passive, something temporary. Vanessa ended the call a minute later, placing her phone on the counter with a small, satisfied motion before returning to what she had been doing. When she spoke to me again, her tone was unchanged, polite, controlled, exactly as it had always been. "I was thinking of reorganizing some of the storage upstairs," she said. "There are a few things we probably do not need anymore." I looked at her then, just briefly, meeting her eyes with the same calm expression I had maintained since the night in the hallway. "That sounds fine," I replied. "Just let me know if you need anything." She smiled, a little more relaxed now, as if my response had confirmed something for her. That was the third mistake. They believed agreement meant ignorance. They believed silence meant acceptance. They believed that because I did not question them, I did not understand them. That evening, after dinner, Michael sat across from me in the living room, scrolling through something on his phone while Vanessa moved quietly between rooms, adjusting small details that no one else would notice. "We should probably set a date soon," he said suddenly, not looking up. The words were directed into the air, but I knew they were meant for Vanessa. "There is no reason to wait much longer." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. "I agree," she said. "Everything is already in place." "Already?" The word returned again, steady and consistent, like a thread running through everything they said. I kept my gaze on the book in my hands, though I had not read a single line. "What are you setting a date for?" I asked, my tone casual, almost absent-minded, as if the question had come from a place of simple curiosity. There was a brief pause, just long enough to notice, not long enough to raise alarm. Michael cleared his throat. "Just some paperwork," he said. "Nothing important." "Nothing important." I nodded once, letting the answer pass without challenge. "That is good," I said quietly. "It is always better to take care of things early." Vanessa's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual, as if she were measuring something, weighing the possibility of doubt. Then she smiled again and stepped back, satisfied. They had reached a point where they no longer felt the need to hide completely. Not because they were careless, but because they believed the outcome was inevitable. That whatever they had started could only move in one direction. Later that night, as I sat alone in my room, the house settling into silence around me, I let everything I had seen and heard come together without resistance. The conversation in the kitchen, the documents in the folder, the phone call, the word "already," repeated again and again, as if the future had already been decided without me. They were not waiting for permission. They were waiting for time. Time to complete what they had started. Time for me to become what they had already assumed I was. Someone who would not interfere. Someone who would not notice. Someone who would not act. I folded my hands in my lap and sat there for a long moment, not thinking about what they had done, but about what I would do next. Because now, there was no uncertainty left. No missing pieces. Only one simple truth. They thought they had already won. And that belief would be the one thing they would not see coming. The next morning, I made the call. Not in a hurry, not with urgency, but with the kind of calm that comes when a decision has already settled into place. Daniel Benton answered on the second ring, his voice steady, professional, unchanged from the day before. I told him I was ready to move forward. I did not explain why. I did not need to. "We will proceed carefully," he said, and I could hear the shift in his tone, the quiet understanding that this was no longer a consultation, but an action. We scheduled everything for that afternoon. I told Vanessa I had an appointment, something routine, nothing worth discussing. She nodded without much interest, her attention already on something else, something she believed mattered more. That was the fourth mistake. They had stopped watching me completely. At the office, everything moved with a quiet precision that I recognized immediately. Papers were prepared. Details were reviewed. Not rushed, not dramatic, just clear and deliberate. Daniel explained each step in a measured tone, making sure I understood exactly what was being changed, what was being removed, what was being restored. Access permissions revoked. Authorization reassigned. Ownership clarified. Words that carried weight without needing to be spoken loudly. I signed where I needed to sign, my hand steady, my mind clear. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, only a quiet certainty that had been missing for longer than I realized. "Once this is processed," Daniel said, "any previous access will no longer apply." I nodded once. "Good," I replied. That was all. No explanation, no emotion, just a simple acknowledgement that something had been corrected. When I stepped back outside, the air felt different again, not sharper this time, but lighter, as if something invisible had been lifted. I did not rush home. I stopped at a small cafe nearby, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching people pass by without noticing me. There is a certain freedom in being overlooked, in existing just outside the center of other people's attention. It gives you space to move without interference. I took a slow sip and let the moment settle. They believed everything was already in place. They believed nothing could be changed. And now, without a single raised voice, without a single confrontation, everything had already shifted back. I returned home just before 5 in the afternoon. Vanessa was in the kitchen again, the familiar rhythm of her movements unchanged, her expression calm, controlled. "How was your appointment?" she asked lightly, glancing up for only a second. "Routine," I said. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to what she was doing. That was the fifth mistake. She did not ask questions because she believed she already knew the outcome. Michael came home later that evening, his energy slightly different, though he probably did not realize it himself. There was a subtle confidence in the way he moved, a sense of anticipation that had not been there before. "We should finalize things this week," he said to Vanessa as he set his keys down. "There is no reason to wait anymore." Vanessa smiled, a quiet, knowing expression that matched his tone perfectly. "I agree," she said. "Everything is already aligned." Already. The word again. Consistent. Unquestioned. Certain. I sat in my chair, listening, not reacting, not interrupting, letting their confidence fill the room the way it always had. They were not pretending anymore. Not fully. They had crossed that line where secrecy turns into expectation, where hidden plans become assumed outcomes. Later that night, after the house had settled into silence, I walked through each room slowly, the same way I had done before, but this time, everything felt different. Not uncertain, not distant, just clear. The furniture was the same. The walls held the same photographs. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt layered with something hidden beneath it. It felt still, controlled, mine. I paused in the hallway, the same place where I had first heard them, the same place where everything had begun to shift. I could almost hear the echo of that quiet laughter again, the careful tone in Vanessa's voice, the confidence in Michael's response. They had believed that moment was the beginning of their ending, that it marked the point where everything had already been decided. I stood there for a moment longer, my hand resting lightly against the wall, just as it had that night, and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath. They were right about one thing. Something had already been decided, just not what they thought. They had celebrated too early. And now, they were about to find out why. They chose Thursday. I knew it before they said it out loud. There is a certain tone people use when they believe they are close to finishing something, a quiet certainty that replaces caution. That morning, Vanessa moved through the house with a sense of purpose that was no longer hidden. Michael checked his phone more often, his responses shorter, his attention already leaning toward what was about to happen rather than what was in front of him. I followed my usual routine. Coffee, window, silence. Nothing out of place. Nothing to suggest that anything had already changed. Around 10 in the morning, Vanessa stepped into the living room, her expression composed but brighter than usual. "We have an appointment this afternoon," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We would like you to come with us. It is just to finalize a few things." I looked up at her, meeting her eyes for a brief moment before nodding. "Of course," I replied, "if you think it is necessary." She smiled, relieved by the lack of resistance, and that relief told me everything I needed to know. They had expected hesitation, maybe even confusion, but not agreement. Not this kind of quiet cooperation. That was the sixth mistake. We left the house together just after 1. Michael drove. Vanessa sat in the front seat, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. I sat in the back, looking out the window as the town passed by in slow, familiar patterns. No one spoke much during the drive. There was nothing left to discuss. In their minds, everything had already been decided. The office was smaller than I expected, not the one I had visited earlier, but another firm, one I did not recognize. Vanessa led the way inside, greeting the receptionist with a confidence that suggested this was not her first time there. Of course it was not. We were shown into a conference room where a man in a dark suit stood up to greet us. He introduced himself, shook hands, and gestured for us to sit. There were documents already laid out on the table, neatly arranged, waiting. Prepared. I took my seat without comment, folding my hands in my lap, my expression calm, my posture steady. Vanessa sat beside Michael, her eyes briefly scanning the papers as if confirming that everything was in place. "This should not take long," the man said, his tone professional, routine. He began explaining the documents, using words I had already heard in a different office. Transfer, authorization, simplification, terms designed to sound helpful, efficient, necessary. Michael nodded along, his attention focused, his confidence growing with each sentence. Vanessa remained composed, but I could see the anticipation beneath it, the quiet satisfaction of reaching a conclusion she had worked toward for months. When the man finished speaking, he slid the papers slightly closer to me. "If everything looks correct, we can proceed with the signatures," he said. I looked down at the documents, my eyes moving slowly across the pages, not because I needed to read them, but because I wanted to give the moment its full. Wait, this was the point they had been waiting for. The final step. The confirmation that everything they believed was already theirs would become official. I placed my hand lightly on the paper, then paused. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention. Just enough. "Before we proceed," I said calmly, lifting my gaze to meet the man's eyes, "I would like to clarify something." The room shifted just slightly. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression tightening in a way he did not fully control. Vanessa's posture remained steady, but her eyes sharpened, watching me more closely now. "Of course," the man replied. "What would you like to clarify?" I let a small breath pass, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. "I want to confirm that any previous authorizations that were made without my direct approval are no longer valid," I said. The words were simple, clear, unavoidable. There was a brief silence, the kind that does not need to be filled because its meaning is already understood. The man glanced down at the documents, then back at me, his expression shifting from routine to attentive. "That would depend on whether those authorizations have been formally revoked," he said carefully. "They have," I replied. I reached into my handbag and placed the folder from Daniel Benton on the table, sliding it forward just enough for him to see. As of yesterday afternoon. This time, the silence was different. He opened the folder, scanning the contents quickly, professionally, his eyes moving with increasing focus. Michael leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence beginning to fracture, though he had not yet found the words to express it. Vanessa did not move at all, but I could see the change in her expression, the way her certainty paused, recalculated. These documents indicate that all prior access permissions have been rescinded, the man said slowly, looking up from the folder. Effective immediately. I nodded once. That is correct. No raised voices. No accusations. Just facts, placed carefully where they could not be ignored. Michael turned toward Vanessa, confusion and realization colliding in his expression. What does that mean? He asked, his voice lower now, less certain. Vanessa did not answer immediately. For the first time since I had known her, she did not have control of the room. I folded my hands again and sat back slightly in my chair, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. It means, I said quietly, that nothing has been transferred, nothing has been finalized, and nothing will be, without my decision. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. The man in the suit closed the folder and set it back on the table, his attention now fully aligned with mine. In that case, he said, we cannot proceed with these documents as they are. Michael sat back, his silence now complete, his earlier certainty gone. Vanessa remained still, but the confidence that had defined her every movement had shifted into something else. Something quieter, something uncertain. I stood up slowly, not as an exit, but as a conclusion. Thank you for your time, I said to the man, my voice steady. Then I turned toward the door, pausing only for a moment before stepping out. I did not look back immediately. I did not need to. I already knew what they were seeing for the first time. Not confusion, not anger, but the simple truth they had overlooked from the beginning. They had celebrated too early.